Good afternoon, and welcome to the Full Scottish on this, the 27th of October. Full Scottish is broadcasting Scotland's look at the stories of the headlines of the previous week, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by two guests who have kindly given up time on their Sunday to discuss the stories behind the headlines with me. First guest is Councillor Vicky Nicolson, who is Councillor for Inverleith on Edinburgh City Council and SNP spokesperson on health and social care. Welcome, Vicky.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
And my second guest is Emma Grae, author and journalist from Glasgow, who has written 3 books, one for children, The Hullet That Couldna Fly, and 2 for older readers, Be Good to Your Mammy and The Tongue That Speaks, all in various ways championing the Scots lead. So welcome, Emma.
Hi there.
We start the programme today, as we always do, with an update from Ukraine on this day 977 since the full-scale Russian invasion of the country. A string of Russian attacks killed and injured civilians in widely separated parts of Ukraine, officials said. The number of people killed in the central city of Dnipro after Russian missile attacks rose to 5, including a child, local officials said. A Russian glide bomb killed 1 person and injured 3 on Saturday in Kostyantinivka, near the front line in Donetsk region, the regional governor said. Russian shelling also killed 2 people in a small town west of the southern city of Kherson, and a Russian drone strike killed a teenager in Kyiv during a nighttime barrage on the Ukrainian capital that lasted for hours, officials said. The latest attacks prompted Volodymyr Zelensky to issue a new call to Kyiv's allies on Saturday to intensify pressure on Moscow. In his nightly video address, he said the assault showed Russia was determined to continue its aggression, adding, "These are conditions in which the lack of stronger decisions from partners to support Ukraine only encourages Putin to invest further in terror." President Zelensky said that the world can stop the escalation of war. Abstractions and words are not enough for this. Concrete steps are needed. Finance ministers of the G7 nations vowed on Saturday to step up efforts to prevent Russia from evading sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine. A December 2022 agreement was intended to limit Russian petroleum sales and revenues without curbing exports so sharply that it would cause global oil prices to soar. But some countries, notably China, have continued to import Russian crude oil without observing the price ceiling. We remain committed to taking further initiatives in response to oil price cap violations, the group said in a statement after meeting in Washington. President Zelensky has warned that Russia is planning to send North Korean troops into battle against his country. He has said Ukrainian intelligence had determined that the first North Korean military will be used by Russia in combat zones between Sunday and Monday, and that the deployment was an obvious escalating move by Russia. Russia's defense ministry said its forces had taken control of the Alexandropol settlement in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, where it has made a string of advances in recent months. The ministry also reported its air defences brought down 51 Ukrainian drones over 4 regions near the border. Russia continues to struggle to make headway, pushing Ukrainian forces out of its Kursk border region after an incursion almost 3 months ago. Georgia's ruling party is leading in a pivotal parliamentary election that could mean the country is heading for closer ties with neighbouring Russia. The vote is widely seen as a make-or-break vote for the country's long-held aspiration for EU membership. If the partial results confirm the victory of the Georgian Dream Party, the country could be heading for closer ties with neighbouring Russia. Its campaign centred on a conspiracy theory about a, quote, global war party that controls Western institutions and is seeking to drag Georgia into the Russia-Ukraine war. The elections in Georgia follow a referendum and general election in Moldova earlier this week, which saw a vote in favour of joining the EU and the re-election of the pro-EU president, despite reports of widespread interference by Russia. I would just caveat the news from Moldova with the electoral interference. Earlier in the week, law enforcement reported that around $14 million was transferred from Russia in September to influence voters. And Friday or Saturday, a list of 3,789 contacts paid by Shore, that's the pro-Russian party in Moldova, was leaked to the Moldovan press. And the Constitutional Court still has to ratify, and electoral fraud may be a consideration, the referendum, and Maya Sandu's victory was not large enough to avoid a runoff election a week today. But back to Ukraine first, Vicky, and many of us will have seen pictures of Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, bowing in front of Putin at the BRICS meeting in Kazan in Russia. This after he had refused to go to the first peace conference convened by President Zelensky. Stuart MacDonald, former SNP MSP for the Glasgow constituency, said that he should resign immediately after this dreadful error. So I wonder what you think about his personal action and how it leaves the United Nations looking on Ukraine.
But I'm not massively educated in this area. However, I did hear about Stuart MacDonald's comments and about Guterres' meeting with or bowing in front of Putin. So as you've said, that not only makes us question the credibility of Guterres himself, but by association, the UN. And at a time, as you've already gone into, where there's widespread feelings that there's been interference by Russia in elections around about neighbouring countries, the concern over Putin's warning of retaliation in Ukraine if NATO and the US allow the use of long-range weapons inside Russia, and the control that the Russians are now taking in Dnipro and Donetsk region. It's very concerning that the UN seems to be not neutral as they should be in this situation, and seem to be prioritising their relationship with Russia and Putin over that with Ukraine and Zelensky.
Thank you, Emma. I know you didn't want to get involved in the specifics of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova for that matter. But one worrying thing from Moldova is this amount of money going into to buy votes, which of course is not unique to Moldova. We had the story this week also of Elon Musk offering £1 million a day to the lucky winner of contributors to his PAC supporting Donald Trump. What are your feelings about funding in politics? Is this a worldwide problem, and is there anything can be done about it?
It's hard to say. I just think it's exploiting the austerity that exists around the world right now and the fact that people are desperate. I think that, especially associating Trump with that money, I mean, we didn't get the performance that we would have ideally liked from Biden over the past 4 years in America. And I think that Elon Musk in particular buying Twitter and then, being so pro Trump and again giving Trump a voice on that platform, it's just very, very concerning. And I think it's tapping into the suffering of people to make them vote in a particular way that might not actually be to their benefit.
Yes, indeed. Is it something we need to worry about in Britain? I
mean, it's hard to say because, from what I've seen, the Labour government haven't done anything that we've thought or hoped that they would. I don't even know where to start with UK politics. I just think it's a complete mess right now. I don't know where. It doesn't seem, obviously we've got this budget coming up, and again I can only unfortunately see things getting worse. So yeah, I don't know where the money would come to bribe people in that way unless some very rich person decides to get involved, although there are, as we know, a lot of very rich opinionated people in the UK, so it is a possibility.
Vicky, it does seem to be done in a different way in Britain. It's not going out and bribing individual voters, but a lot of money goes to politicians themselves. Is this something that we should control?
Well, The last couple of months, the first couple of months of the new Labour government have been quite eye-opening, although the media has reported the behaviour of the new UK ministers in particular, and including the Prime Minister and his wife, in a way that they possibly haven't scrutinised the previous outgoing Conservative government. But repeated reports of tickets for Taylor Swift because my daughter's a fan, and new clothes and even spectacles for free for people who earn much more than your average person, leaves a really bad taste for people, and it is something that a lot of people speak to me about, and it has eroded the trust in the new government before they've even really begun, before their first budget.
Okay, thank you both. We turn now to Gaza. At least 42,924 Palestinians have been killed and 100,833 wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, and more than 2,653 have been killed and 12,360 wounded in Lebanon. As Israel steps up tensions by bombing Iran, the world is watching to see how Iran will respond. The UN has called on Israel to stop what it is doing and warned that the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. Well, I've been presenting news on Gaza for many months now, and I don't think one good news story has come out of it. This week is no different. Journalists killed, shooting inside the Kamal Adwan hospital, the medics all detained in a single room by the IDF. John Swinney marked a year since Israel's ground operation began with a call for peace and the recognition of a Palestinian state, which is not unique among world politicians, yet the Israeli government seems set on making sure there's no Palestine by wiping out the population of Gaza. It seems rather helpless to shrug and say what can be done, but what can be done, Emma?
I think they need to do more than just, economic sanctions. I mean, the protests, people are making their voices known in the UK and beyond, but it just seems like from a governmental perspective, this is going to go down as a very, very, one of the big shames of history. It's shocking that we could, for decades condemn the Holocaust and what happened in Germany, yet in a modern world, watch a similar sort of situation go on. And not only that, we have access to the Palestinian people on social media. They're telling us what's going on. They're telling us how they're suffering. And no one with any power seems to be prepared to do anything. It all seems to be, at a grassroots level that people are, and obviously you've got charities that are, helping as much as they can. But there really needs to be decisive action taken before there is no one left to help.
Vicky, what are your thoughts?
So I was at the SNP conference last October when Hamza and his wife Nadia stood on stage and called for an immediate ceasefire, and that has been our party's position ever since. And I'm also a mother. I've got two daughters, 26 and 16, who both march for peace in Palestine on a very regular basis, and as do I. And we need to end this ethnic cleansing. We need to end this. I heard Shona Robeson this morning on Radio Scotland saying just that, and it's so concerning. Obviously, that we're looking at a situation where the entire population of North Gaza may be wiped out. 40 more Palestinians were killed yesterday. It's been reported. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, we have a move further into the Middle East by Israel. We've got the Ayatollah stating that it's their duty to respond, and is currently deciding what that response should be. It's a very, very worrying and disgraceful time when it doesn't seem to matter what any Western countries say to Israel. They are not changing their approach even slightly.
Indeed, and I alluded to the United Nations in the piece on Ukraine. Now, the United Nations has had so many resolutions against Israel over the years, which have been totally ignored. But do you think that even the call for peace now is weakened by Guterres position on Ukraine and standing in the world?
Well, I can't see how it can't be weakened by that action when we are we have to stay strong and resolute as to the UN in this situation. And as you say, the UN has repeatedly for years called on Israel to change the way that they behave in Gaza. And now Guterres seems to be taking a partisan stance in Ukraine and Russia. So that can only weaken people's perceptions of what the UN is capable of achieving in Gaza, I feel.
Okay, thank you again, both. One thing which may have a huge effect on both Ukraine and Palestine, Israel, will be the election of the US president. In the polls, the election seems to be too close to call. So will turnout be the deciding factor? And there are a number of other questions which will be answered by polling. Will women make the difference for Kamala Harris? Will voters who are angry at Harris or Israel stay at home, or will they hold their nose and simply vote against Trump? Will the economy be decisive? We tend to look at the United States based on foreign affairs, but that's not the way most US electors will see things. And then there's the F word, fascism. Trump had spent the week saying how much he admired fascist dictators and then took umbrage at being called a fascist himself. Is this something that's going to play in the election? So I've asked a lot of questions there in one. So your thoughts, Emma, on the US election?
I hate to say it because I hate to say it because I think it's what's going to happen. I do think Trump will probably get in. I think, unfortunately, America is a very vast, big country where people haven't, again, in some ways like the UK, they haven't seen the change that they've wanted over the past 4 years. They did, get Trump out and they did give the Democrats a chance. And I think that obviously, especially at the start of this election campaign with Joe Biden and the cognitive issues that he appeared to be displaying, and then replacing him, at a later stage with Kamala, they could have approached it in a better way. And I just unfortunately fear that America is quite a historically sexist country, and I think that that'll also play into the results. I think if, as much as you don't want to admit it as a woman, it's also, you have to sort of say, I do think that there will be a lot of people that won't want to vote for Kamala for that reason. And also, Trump himself has a very, in some ways, an anti-war stance. And I've heard a lot of people say that even though they don't want to vote for Trump, they feel like he would better protect the US's interests. And I think that could get him more left-leaning votes that he would have otherwise never got.
Your thoughts, please, Vicky.
Well, that was quite depressing, Emma.
Sorry.
So I remember before I changed career and became a counsellor, I worked as a social worker in Edinburgh, and we had a vote actually in our team about whether Trump would win the last election that he won. And I believed that he would win, and he did, and I won £20, which, I would happily not won that £20. But what I'm seeing and hearing this time firstly from my mother, who is absolutely obsessed with this election. It's how she's retired now, and it's become her job is to follow, US election coverage, be that on YouTube or elsewhere. She is strongly of the opinion that most Republicans do think they're ahead, but that the voting has been fairly stable since Kamala announced. She is looking at two of the national polling sources rather than the 80 polls, and many of those polls are Republican polls, the 80-odd polls that have recently been established. And I think that's where a lot of Republicans are getting their belief that they are way ahead from. She doesn't necessarily believe that. Not that, she's the expert, but she's more of an expert than me. But what she's saying to me is it's too close to call. There's encouraging signs in the early votes, especially about how many women are voting, which will bode well for Harris. As you've said, most swing states are showing stats that early voters are over 55% women. So if Kamala does win women significantly, that still leaves the issue that Trump will potentially win men, and then it becomes an issue of turnout, and women do traditionally turn out at higher rates. So fingers crossed there. So holding down margins with men seems to be a big priority message in the last few days. I don't know if anyone saw Michelle Obama's speech yesterday addressing men to think of the women in their lives when they're voting. I found that hugely inspiring. I hope that others also do. So I'm cautiously, very, very cautiously optimistic, and I really would hate to think that Trump's going to get in.
Okay, well, I can offer some support to your mum in that Professor Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews, was making exactly that same point about the polls. So she's in good company there. You both mentioned women, and I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned the potential effect of Wade versus Roe and abortion rights in the US. Do you not think that will play a very big role in voting? And also, given that there are referenda in various states on the issue coinciding with the presidential election. Emma, I'll let you go first.
I mean, I remember when Roe v. Wade was overturned and we were covering it at the time. It's just, it's a hard one to say because I think overall most women would vote for those rights to be there. But I think the thing we also kind of forget about America is it's a very religious country in some sectors, some parts of there are women in America who do think that was the right thing to do. It is a very much a hot potato, and it's obviously super interesting that Melania, completely opposed to what her husband said about abortion, which in some ways might give people hope, I guess, who maybe agree with some of Trump's stances that maybe he would adopt a more relaxed approach, even though there's no indication of that. So it's hard to say, I really think.
Okay, Vicky, do you have a view on that?
That's an interesting point about Melania, and I haven't actually. I knew that she came out against Trump's perspective there, but I hadn't really considered that people might see her as an opportunity for Trump to change his position. Well, there hopefully is going to be a huge increase in young voters as well, and I would hope that young voters will be more inclined to have a strong position there. You're right what you say, Emma, about America being a hugely religious country. I myself have family members in Kentucky who are of the Baptist faith and who are Republican voters but cannot bring themselves to vote for Trump. So perhaps there's a wee glimmer of hope there as well.
Okay, there's one other side issue which intrigues me. What are your thoughts on UK politicians going to the United States to canvass in the election? Because I ask because I can imagine what my reaction would be if an American politician knocked on my door here seeking to influence how I voted in a Scottish election or UK general election. Emma?
It's just outrageous. Like, why get involved? Like, it always seems to be as well. Like without naming names, it's like has been UK politicians that just decide to get involved in these things, maybe because they're planning on writing another book or something like that, so they can say they were there. But yeah, it's definitely bizarre behavior. But I guess they're a known face and they want to keep getting a platform to express their opinions.
Vicky?
Well,
you have an MP who's doing it at the moment. MSP, sorry.
My MSP, unfortunately for me,
Right.
and the group leader of the Lib Dems in Edinburgh Council, Kevin Lang, is also there with Alex Cole-Hamilton, and it did surprise me a little because I thought, oh gosh, look, there's the Lib Dems pretending to be Democrats. But I suppose we should maybe not go there. We have got members of our, activist group who have come here as students in the SNP. I've got one really good friend who came over here as an activist and turned up to a campaign session expecting to have to witness a a speech from the person they were campaigning for, but instead was handed a bunch of leaflets and asked to go and deliver them to some tenements. So I think that's a bit different, obviously, people coming to live in this country and getting involved in campaigning. But I don't feel as strongly as Emma does about it, but it has surprised me recently to see some of the people that have gone abroad to campaign. And yes, I think it's interesting.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, now Emma already trailed the next item with as the voice of doom and gloom, and that's the UK budget. So what do we expect the budget to bring this week? If the fiscal rules are changed, what will that mean for borrowing and in turn for spending and public service cuts? If workers don't feel pain in their pay packet, uh, if taxes are not rising for them, will they instead feel it in rising costs and poorer services? And as ever, the implication, what will be the outcome in Barnett consequentials for Scotland? So I'll let you start on this, Vicky.
So I did listen to Shona Robeson this morning on the radio saying that she's written to the UK government asking that national insurance proposed increases are fully met within consequentials. That is one potential serious issue for our Scottish budget. Yesterday, the STV led with a website led with Scotland's block grant falls to the lowest share of UK spending in a decade. We've seen a fall of 12.7%, less, so to 6.4 billion, which is less than in 2021 in Scotland. The capital budget cuts have been dreadful for Scotland, for Edinburgh. That the services that I know of, for example, the new eye hospital in Edinburgh is something that's had to be put on the back burner. Our resource budget's been cut by 15% since 2020. And that takes money from the NHS, from schools, police, housing, roads, hospitals. And Reeves is talking about delivering sustainable growth, changing the fiscal rules to allow more borrowing. I think we can't afford not to grow the economy. And we can't afford to see a UK government budget which doesn't acknowledge that we need investment. Our public services desperately need resources, and so falling investment is not what we need. And I think borrowing for investment is required as long as that money is spent on the right things and things that will grow GDP. We're in such a difficult position, and I believe that it. Although he came out and denied it, Ian Murray will have control of the £150 million of levelling up money, which I don't know if you'll remember that money used to be, it's there to replace the EU money that used to go for distribution in the Scottish Government. And now this is going to force the Scottish Government into a situation where we have to work with the Scottish Office while they distribute funds that used to be the responsibility of the Scottish Government. So this budget will be very, very interesting for Scotland and potentially very damaging. And at a time when we really are having to cut our cloth in ways that are so unpalatable. I sit on the Integration Joint Board in Edinburgh and I have, as I said, a background in social work. And some of the decisions that we're asked to make, we're kind of damned if we do and damned if we don't. We're making decisions now so that we can barely meet our statutory responsibilities as a board who govern the Integration Joint Board. So that's the Health and Social Care Partnership Board, which decides how we deliver certain hospital services and NHS services in the community and social care. There's no more cuts that we can make. There are no more efficiencies that we can make. There are no more savings that we can make. So we need a budget that works for Scotland. Desperately need a budget that allows the UK to borrow for the right reasons, I believe, to grow the economy.
Thank you. Emma, you said you didn't expect anything good in the budget, so what do you expect?
Well, I mean, I'll start off by saying I'm not a politician, so the wider implications of the budget are something that, aren't, affecting me personally. For me, the things that I'm thinking about are, the issue with council tax. Are they going to scrap the discount, which is already ridiculously it should be 50% if there's one person living in the house, as far as I'm concerned. I also would be concerned about any potential cuts to university fees, or getting rid of them altogether. I think Scotland could potentially, it's one of the big advantages that Scottish students have, is that we can leave university and not be saddled with like 50 to £100,000 worth of debt, which seems to be the case in England. This idea that that could be an area where cuts are made is really, really concerning, I think. And I think for the young people in particular, I'm worried about like what that'll look like for them, especially within the private sector, where it does get hit a lot harder by it's not going to be considered. And it seems like in the private sector that those at the top are only getting richer, and I don't know if the budget's going to do anything to change that.
Yeah, tax. There was a promise that there would be no increase in income tax for or national insurance contributions for workers, but that does not exclude national insurance contribution for employers. And one thing in that, you probably know that Emma is a journalist. Many are self-employed, and therefore they're paying both their workers' national insurance contribution, and they are their own employer, so they're paying that as well. So that will make a difference to many self-employed people, and many who are forced to be contractors, not necessarily because they want to be working in companies. So if you could give some advice to the Chancellor on where tax should be changed, what would you go for?
Simple tax the rich, easy. I think
That's rich, okay.
tax the rich, yeah, simple as that yeah. But again, this could be from a point of total naivety as someone who's not a politician, but it does seem like a simple request, because as well as that, as someone who has been self-employed and will be self-employed at the moment, the rates that people are getting paid, in theory, self-employed people should be paid slightly more to make up for these things, so that they can pay these things. But it does seem like companies, especially in the private sector, know that people are more desperate now than they have been in the past. And from what I've seen, the rates are getting lower, which is very, very concerning, especially for people who are self-employed. They're already doing their own tax returns. They've already got all this extra admin. This idea that they could be doing all that and left with so little at the end of the day is really, really concerning.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you to determine policy here, but when you say tax the rich, what do you suggest? Would that be a wealth tax, a higher rate of income tax above a certain figure, or to clamp down on death duties?
I think obviously a wealth tax would be great. I think there's no need for the UK to have, the Sunday Times rich list. The amount of wealth that people have on that is just outrageous. And unfortunately, the people that have these wealth tend to, put it into property. I was told that the house that I'm living in right now was bought for £25,000 in the 1980s. And I know for a fact that I think I could pay it outright in maybe 2 years with the amount of rent I'm paying, which is insane. And these houses, the landlords are completely absent. They're just investments. And unfortunately, because of that, with the amount of investments they have, they're only getting richer. So that's a problem. But also corporations as well that are making large amounts of money. There's no reason, once it gets beyond a threshold, there's making profit, and then there's just pure greed.
Thank you. Vicky, what advice would you give the Chancellor on tax?
Well, at the recent, Emma, can I just say I really empathise with, that situation as a self-employed person that you find yourself in. And I've never been self-employed myself, but it is something I often think about when we talk about taxation. We really maybe don't think enough about people in that situation who are self-employed but are not, rolling in it, or making lots of money in business. And the recent SNP conference, actually, I was really honoured to second a resolution asking for the SNP to look to land and wealth taxation as a both feasible and effective way to stick to our principles and the priorities and principles of our party, which are what is the fairest way to do things. And so the STUC posed a challenge to the SNP, asking us to look to the way that we already are taxing wealth, and we've already raised £1.5 billion with devolved tax powers. It's an unpopular decision for some people, and many people do criticise the SNP for this. However, it fits with our priorities, and I believe that if we can improve our public services, not as a cost but as an investment by using increased taxation both across the UK and in Scotland, then we should of course do that. Would be my view.
Emma mentioned council tax and single person discount, which is obviously something which is of major importance to you, Vicky, as a city councillor. Now, the SNP has talked in the past about reforming council tax, and it hasn't happened for various reasons, COVID being a very good one. And the National, I believe, is starting a series this week looking at alternatives to council tax. As a councillor, what's your view on it, seeing that's how your city survives, essentially?
Yes, I think every single councillor at the SNP conference where the announcement was made to freeze council tax took a deep and shocked intake of breath. And while a lot of people wrote to me as a councillor saying thank you, at this time when we're in a cost of living crisis, it's actually been very helpful. I don't believe that it's something we should repeat, and I don't necessarily believe we should have frozen council tax in the first place. I'm strongly in favour of reforming council tax, and in fact in our SNP budget, although we are in opposition in the council, we did propose a different way of using council tax in the city with no increases at the lower end of house valuations and much higher increases at the top end, which doesn't always work for everybody, because I'm often told, to have many people who are cash poor living in expensive houses. But I think compared to a lot of the problems that people in society have these days, that's probably on the less pressing end of our societal issues. I think council tax is a good reform of council tax is a good opportunity for us to target wealth tax rather than the way that things are done at the moment. When I can't remember what year it was that council tax bans were last assessed, but I think it was in the 1990s. So obviously things have changed a lot since then, and there are people living in very big houses with huge incomes who... Sorry? Oh, I thought I missed you saying something there. There are people with huge incomes and huge houses paying very little council tax, which doesn't seem fair when that's one of the main ways that we fund our public services.
Okay, thank you. Another stoushe which arose during the week was the Commonwealth heads of government asking for reparations for the UK's role in the slave trade. Opposition to this call said that people alive today should not pay for the actions of their ancestors, although wealth owned by many families, including the royal family and institutions, were made by their ancestors profiting from slavery. Even when the UK ended the slave trade, it compensated owners and not slaves, giving the owners £20 million for what was then termed loss of property, the equivalent today of around £300 million. Now, £205 billion is the figure which has been bandied about as compensation to the Caribbean nations. And now no one denies the brutality of British rule as set out, for example, in John Newsinger's book, The Blood Never Dried. But it did strike me, if you were calling for this, that you'd have to give some thought also to African nations who had their people, their resources taken away and transported to the West Indies. But what about the general principle of reparations for this, Emma?
I mean, I think it's about that direct link, really, isn't it? And how it affects people today. The monarchy is the most obvious example. I think the duchy profits are at the highest they've ever been, and that money is being used to reinvest back into Buckingham Palace, but actually to throw back to the palace. I believe I was paying the same amount of council tax as the palace was, and I certainly don't live in a palace. So yeah, and obviously the recent the tour to Australia, there were protests about the ongoing, and I think the king is aware of the problematic aspects of the monarchy's past, but for them to sit on the amount of wealth that they're sitting on right now and not try and do something about it, there is a huge problem there. When I was doing some work recently, I was looking into what the monarchy was paying people to work for them. They were looking for someone to sort of be it was sort of an art archive role at Windsor Castle in London, and they were offering £28,000, which is not enough money to live in London, not by a long shot, least of all to work at the royal household and to go in there and deal with these valuable objects, some of which controversially don't technically belong to the UK monarchy. I'm not saying there's examples of it in Windsor Castle, I don't know that, but I think that they have a good, they would be a very good place to start, and it might snowball in that sense, because where the wealth is, maybe at least take a bit more responsibility for where it came from, least of all take advantage of people in the here and now.
So you think not for the country as a whole to do, but the royal family should put its hand in its
I think they
boots
would,
on
yeah,
this
I think
one.
they should put, yeah.
Okay, Vicky, what's your view on reparations?
So I have read a little bit about this. I've also got a teenager who's recently been studying the North Atlantic slave trade in history. So we've had some very interesting conversations in our house. Listened to Clive Lewis yesterday, or maybe the day before, talking about this on the radio, stating that his family were or enslaved people, and that Britain should pay. He's been a long time campaigner for reparations. My view is that reparations are the right and the fair thing to do. How we go about that and how we fund that, I'm not 100% sure. I think I would have to take part in a wider debate on that and read much more widely about it. Interestingly, the compensation that was paid to slave owners, although I don't like that terminology, obviously, in 1837, we've only just finished paying for. And I recently attended a lecture by a wonderful woman, Tamsin Granger, who was talking about North Edinburgh and the impact of the North Atlantic slave trades, and the impact of some of that compensation in this area, where it built the framework for industry in this country. So, not only did these people get rich because of the compensation scheme that we finished paying off in 2015 as a country, they got rich again on the back of the industry that they were able to fund the infrastructure for from the money from the compensation scheme that I don't think any enslaved people ever saw a penny of.
The question which strikes me is where do you stop on this? Emma, you're a Glaswegian. Glasgow's tobacco lords benefited from the import of tobacco from Virginia and made generations of people sick. In Edinburgh, some of the banks profited greatly, particularly the private banks, from the opium trade in China. Is this not just opening a can of worms to all kinds of claims for compensation? Emma?
There's an argument to be made that that's the case. I think you'd have to really look at, is the profiting still going on, and if it is, then I would say there would maybe be an argument for some form of compensation if there was profiting still directly from the actions of people's ancestors, which is why I used the royal family as an example.
Okay, Vicky, your thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose that's a really valid question. If you look around Edinburgh and the financial sector that still exists and is still making lots of people very rich, and it's quite an exclusive club that the majority of people don't get to join. I think that, yeah, we should be asking these questions and, rebuilding a fairer society. And how that happens, I'm not an expert there, but it's certainly a conversation I would really like to be part of as we go forward. So yes, we might be opening a can of worms, probably a can of worms worth opening. And where does it end? I don't know. Hopefully with a fairer world where wealth is distributed in a much more fair way, and people every single person's able to have a good life, rather than 1% of people stockpiling the majority of the money that exists.
Yes, no argument with that. But so rarely are any kind of taxes in this country hypothecated, i.e., dedicated to a particular end. So I could imagine if reparations were paid, it would come out of some general fund, i.e., your income tax would go towards paying it. And I'm fond of saying that the most popular taxes are taxes on other people. So, Vicky, as a trade unionist, would you feel comfortable explaining to your members that there's less in their pockets because money is going on slave trade reparations?
Well, I've not given that an awful lot of thought. I think that would be a very difficult conversation to have with people. And um, as a trade unionist, what I've always campaigned for is better wages for people and a better life for people. So certainly trying to explain to some of the lowest paid people in society that they were going to get even less because they had to pay back for the multimillionaires that run the world, I think wouldn't be the easiest conversation to have. No, so yes, I maybe have to go back to the drawing board and read more widely on this subject. Mm-hmm.
And Emma, I don't know how much you've looked into it, but it strikes me that we're talking about historic slavery. We really should be doing something about modern slavery, which is raising its head, not in obscure parts of the world, but in Britain.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's some things that I've seen just through my own research that would make your skin crawl basically. The worst example that I've seen is at least in the south of England, people are now like completely flaunting housing regulations and renting out beds of all things between multiple people, which is something that you would only really imagine going on in the Victorian era, but it's going on in modern Britain. And, these people are spending 400, 500, £600 sometimes to share a bedroom with a complete stranger, raising all these questions about, sexual exploitation. Yeah, it's very, very worrying. And then you've got examples of people, doing other things to make the rent and stuff like that. And it's very, very concerning. And again, obviously the minimum wage has risen, but a lot of companies are flaunting that. They're not necessarily paying the new minimum wage. So I think there's big questions to be asked. And, you've got unpaid overtime written into a lot of workers' contracts these days, and it just seems to be accepted for some weird reason. Not all the time,
Yes,
but in some cases, yeah.
I'm sure that's something that we will return to in future programs. But let's finish today with Scotland. And Scotland has many stories from its past, but will it still have a distinctive culture left to make new stories for the future? Well, Emma, that's something that you're actively involved in. So, what are your thoughts on the strength of Scottish culture, the attempts to dilute it, and the way forward?
I mean, the attempts to dilute it are all-consuming. Basically, there's a lot going on, but there's also a lot of hope for the future. I think it's fantastic that we've got so many great voices on social media who are still actively promoting it and showing the interest in Scottish culture. Another Scottish author, his name's Kenny Boyle. He's just recently started like a hugely popular series on TikTok about Scottish mythology and explaining all these different stories, because Scotland is steeped in this wealth of brilliant stories, and the interest in that comes from all over the globe. People want to know more about it. It's just a shame that the promotion of Scottish culture right now comes largely from an individual level. Yes, there are people who do get paid for it sometimes, but the actual, big, purely promoting Scottish culture often comes at the expense of, not necessarily getting paid or doing it for free. And obviously we've seen, I Write got cancelled this year. The arts budgets are just getting slashed left, right, and centre. It's becoming increasingly difficult and unsustainable for people to actually attempt to make a mark in the arts. I believe I was very lucky that through being part of the Edinburgh Book Festival, my accommodation was covered in the city, but they were looking at charging me because they weren't sure I was on the list. And I think for like one hotel in Edinburgh for one night during the Fringe, it was like 180, and that probably was cheap compared to what some hotels were charging. And yeah, it's very concerning.
And I'm interested also in your experience of writing in Scots and the hysteria that promotes in some people. I'll let you fill in the details.
Yeah, I mean, it's ongoing. It seems to be a little bit quieter right now, but I don't want to speak too soon because it does seem to pop up every couple of months that someone says something, someone uses it in Parliament, and everybody loses their minds. I mean, I recently wrote about Halloween for the National and all the different words we have, like tumshi, all these great Scottish phrases that if you said them to an English person would mean absolutely nothing. Yet there's this absolute insistence that Scots isn't a real language, but there's no way of really showing that its legitimacy better, I think, than within the written word, because if you compare a piece written in Scots to a piece written in English, you can quite clearly see the difference.
Yeah, you would think it was something we could learn looking at other countries, the experience of Ukraine and Ukrainian being marginalized by the Russians, and the same in Lithuania and the other Baltic states. That we look at it and we condemn it from Scotland, and then we do exactly, or we allow exactly the same thing ourselves to happen here.
Yeah, and it's I think it just comes from like a culture where Scots has been drummed out of people for so long. I mean, I write in Scots. It's the only thing I write in creatively these days. But I never had any Scots formal education. When I went to write in Scots, I could only spell the words based on how they sounded because I did not have that formal education. And obviously there is no standardized, spellings for Scots because they vary so much, Scots words rather, because they vary so much, by region and by their own dialect of the language. But it's good that so many steps are being made to create an education in Scots, but that obviously needs investment, that needs training, and that needs support. And with so many cuts being made across the board, we are at a real risk of still losing that culture because it does, the keeping it alive does seem to fall upon individual shoulders rather than, a country that supports these things that are so important historically and give Scotland such a unique identity compared to, I think every country in the UK has its own unique identity in it, but Scotland, obviously, in particular, I mean, you've got the Welsh language, you've got Irish Gaelic in Ireland, but I just think Scots kind of gets left out the conversation because it is a sister language of English.
Okay, you've mentioned funding there. So, Vicky, I have a one-word question for you about Edinburgh Summer Hall. What's the story there, and will the story continue?
Sure. Okay. So Summer Hall is an amazing cultural space in Edinburgh. Nobody's going to argue with that. It was and is privately funded. It's never been publicly funded.
Mm-hmm.
It's been philanthropically funded, if you like. So I don't think that there is anything happening here in a wider way when it comes to Summer Hall. I think it's an unfortunate sign of the times, and I know that but we've got our councillor who's our culture spokesperson in Edinburgh, Finlay McFarlane. We've got Angus Robertson, people who are taking a great interest in it, but Scotland is in a really tricky situation when it comes to budgets to fund the arts, but we do massively, I believe, massively commit to increasing that funding and have done so recently, which is in stark comparison to what's happening in England and Wales in the culture sphere. A different story, maybe a more interesting story about public funding, would be the People's Story on the Canongate in Edinburgh, which was a museum set up to record the people's story of Edinburgh, and it was set up by Labour in the 80s, a trade unionist, the history of the trade union and real people's lives. And the Labour administration, Edinburgh Council, made a unilateral decision to close it. I think that's a more concerning story. That's something that is so important in telling the stories of our history in this city, which, by the way, on Emma's topic, I'm actually from Ayrshire myself. I've lived in Edinburgh for 25 years, grown up with Burns and Scots, and, encouraged very strongly to learn the poetry and the songs of Burns all year round, not just between kind of Christmas and Burns Day as you do in Edinburgh. But then told not to, speak slang in the classroom. So I really hear where Emma's coming from there. So yeah, we've got huge funding issues right across every sector in Scotland right now, and hopefully the budget will bring something welcome, although I'm not optimistic about that. So yeah, when it comes to Summerhall, it's a wait and see, really. It looks like it may be the end of the road for Summerhall, which is a real sad loss would be a real sad loss to Edinburgh. But I'm proud of the commitment that we've made to funding culture in Scotland, and in a time when there's not enough money to go around anyway. Can I just say to Emma, I've been really reluctant to go on TikTok. I've always resisted until now. I feel that it's probably something that I need to do. I'm just not sure I've got enough hours in the day, because every other different platform already sucks up so much of my life, and all the papers I need to read and reports and things I need to write, etc. But perhaps that's what I'm going to do this afternoon instead of all the laundry that's piled up this week.
And just if you could finish your story about the people's story in the Canongate, what is likely to happen there?
Well, I can't finish the story because the story hasn't got an ending yet. We have, as a political group in the council, we took a motion to ask for it to be reviewed. We strongly hope that it will be reopened. I think the Labour administration and the council have realised their mistake here, and that was something that they should have prioritised above perhaps Edinburgh's 900, where they're spending money on parties all over the city to recognise 900 years of Edinburgh. They perhaps should have funded things that mean much more to the actual people of Edinburgh in the first place.
Okay, thank you. And just to wrap up, Emma, what are you up to in telling Scotland's story now? You said you only wrote creatively in Scots, so what are you working on at the moment?
So I've just wrapped up, we'll have wrapped it up by the end of the year, another children's book called The Moggy That Meowed Too Much, and should hopefully be wrapping up a third adult novel called Kathy Get Your Dancing Shoes On, which very much deals with the social issues of the day that are going on for, young people and, people in their 20s who are trying to get a foot, on the property ladder, or even just as trying to make a career right now. It is very, very difficult, and the book sort of goes with that in modern Scotland. So hopefully it'll say something interesting, but do it in a fun way. That's what I'm aiming for.
Good. Well, I wish you every success with that, and with your current books. I know you have a website, but I don't believe you can buy from there. So Waterstones is the place to go.
Yeah, Waterstones or Leaf Press, they're brilliant.
Good. Okay. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. And before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We're at crisis point and really need your donations right now to be able to pay our bills and to survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you very much to our guests today for giving up part of their Sunday, to Vicky and to Emma. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to you for watching, wherever you're watching, either now or on catch up. And please join us on Broadcasting Scotland in the coming week. But for me, goodbye.